Welcome on behalf of Calgary Public Teachers, ATA Local 38. My name is Caitlin McDermott. I'm a CBE teacher and learning leader, as well as a member of our Local 38 PD committee. I am pleased to introduce Iman Bukhari and Courtney Walcott. Iman holds a master's degree in Multimedia Communications and is the CEO of the Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation and is the producer of the documentary YYC Colours, which examines racism in Calgary. In turn, she has been a trailblazer in both multimedia storytelling and anti-racism advocacy. Courtney Walcott is a local teacher, anti-racism advocate, and community organizer. He has seen many cultural, social, and political shifts throughout the local community that has inspired him to be a more active participant in directing transformative change. Courtney works with local community members to push forward restorative platforms that target systems of oppression that exist throughout our history and today. Please note that there will be a question period at the end of this presentation, in which point I will be sharing a link for feedback. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Iman and Courtney.
Well, thank you. That takes away a whole slide of our presentation. That intro was good. I really appreciate it. Perfect. Well, honestly, everybody, as we open into this, I really just want to express gratitude as always. I always like to really start with gratitude there. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you to being open and engaging in this process for talking to kids about racism, or about race and racism for educators. We'll move forward there. So we already went through the pitch for recording, but once again, it really is very important for everybody just to be very self-aware and to understand and engage in this process kind of openly, despite the fact that it's recording, right? But just it's really important that you know, especially when you're dealing with anything online, how or when you are being recorded, just as we look forward in understanding our technology. So we'd like to begin our official presentation really with a land acknowledgement. And I can tell you there's a couple of reasons as to why we begin with it. I've been in a few situations where the land acknowledgement has just become standard practice, and not always with the reflective process is necessary to understand its value. So despite always starting with the land acknowledgement, I would like to remind people why we do it. I can tell you that everybody's a little different, but I'll tell you a little bit about me. My family in particular, and then that's why I really do enjoy the Canadian kind of history of this all. So my family name is Walcott. That is definitely not an African name. It is very much a plantation name. So when people ask that classic question of where are you from, I've always struggled with it, of course, because I have no answer outside of Canada. And if you want to trace my ancestry back, you can go back to Barbados, but then it ends. There are no records. I do not know where my family comes from. I carry with me a plantation name, so I have no real connection to the land that my family is actually from outside of the land that I'm on. Now, so since I'm in Canada, and that's how I feel about the land that I've lost, then for me, the land acknowledgement is such a great part of this process of reconciliation, because knowing that I've lost land, I can, in a small way, empathize with the Indigenous communities of our country and in the ways that we are standing on their land. So in respect, reciprocity and truth, we honor and acknowledge Mohkinstsis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina nations. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. Finally, we acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and non, who live, work, and play on this land and who honor and celebrate this territory. The sacred gathering place provides us with an opportunity to engage in and demonstrate leadership on reconciliation, So thank you all for your enthusiasm and commitment to joining us here today, even though for most of us it's darks, just like little icons in our screens. Thank you for being here. Move forward. So welcome to class, where Iman and I are running this session very much so in a way in which we would kind of want to demonstrate what we're talking about. And there's some structure to it. So we want to make sure that we have understand terms, right? The one huge process about this process is that we are speaking the same language. We want to really emphasize why we talk about it. And then we want to anchor it home in examples, actual scenarios that I've seen just as a teacher throughout my process within the board. And then we want to help provide you with resources. And then we all want to open it up to show you something amazing that the Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation is working on in collaboration with Alberta Education, the ATA, Local 38. And then of course, we'll end with a question and answer period. I don't think I can do this any better than Caitlin did. So my name is Courtney Walcott again. We're here with Iman Bukhari, and if I can do anything, I will speak to the credit and the work ethic of Iman in this process. She brought me on into this presentation, and she has done what I consider to be very powerful feats within this city to get people to address anti-racism. And I am just glad to be kind of by her side in moments like this. All right. So now this is one of the more significant rules that we have to discuss. I can acknowledge a few things when we have these conversations. And one of the things that I always acknowledge is that this is a challenging thing to discuss. The concepts of race and racism, they're sensitive. They're sensitive for a variety of reasons. They're sensitive because we struggle as Canadians to engage in our own accountability in this process. It's sensitive because people have these lived experiences that these conversations may be triggering or traumatizing. It's sensitive because without the nuance of understanding, sometimes it feels like you're being blamed. When it's simply just asking us to be accountable for our roles in things, whether or not they're intentional. So with these challenges in mind, we always want to set rules for the space. So we want to make sure that we are sharing this space. And significantly, that'll be really important in the question and answer period. So much of this is always something that people want to engage in conversation, but we do want to respect people's time at the end to be able to provide their questions and get direct answers. We want to practice attentive listening. The way that this presentation has been organized is so that we can help you understand some of the more specifics of the language. So it pays to not only just listen to what we're saying, but also attempt to hear it how we want it to be said. We're looking for people to really understand that because this is a space for mistakes, and this is a space to ask the question and see the correction, that we don't judge others in this work because we are proud of people who are engaging in the work. And then that just naturally transitions to the way that we want to respect people. And we definitely want people to speak openly with us because we know that this process is uncomfortable. And the truth is that's exactly how it's supposed to be when you're challenging yourself to grow. So I'm going to hand this off to Iman, who's going to take us through the language, the terminology, and she's going to really support us through this process of understanding what it is we're supposed to know and how we're supposed to talk about it. So.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you for that awesome introduction, Caitlin, and thank you, Courtney, for leading us through the rules and understanding what we're up to. So before we really get into this, we were talking about what we should present, and we thought, first we really need to get terminology correct, because if we're going to have these conversations with children, with the kids in your classroom, you actually need to begin your own anti-racism journey first. And that often means learning and unlearning that needs to take place beforehand. So this is a really vital part of this journey. So first, we just want to talk about race. And what is race? We hear these words all the time and these concepts, but what do they really mean? And it's essentially an incorrect assumption that physical differences such as skin color, hair color, texture, and facial features are actually related to moral, cultural, and intellectual superiority. It is a social construct, meaning that there's no biological reality, there's no race gene. Regardless of social definitions, of course, race is socially constructed, but regardless of the fact that it's a social construct, it actually significantly affects the lives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, particularly living in the West. And the concept of race was created to establish a hierarchy in society. Next, I want to touch on racism. This is a word that's thrown around a lot. And a lot of the times when I see it in the media or even peers that I know, people I work with, they don't have the correct understanding, or they have a little bit of understanding, but not necessarily. So race is a system in which one group of people exercise power over another on the basis of race. So in Canada, it would be white people, as they are a majority, and they did colonize. And racism is a set of beliefs, false assumptions, and actions based on that ideology of superiority. And it's not just judging or hating somebody on their skin tone, but it actually is a system. So meaning it consists of policies and practice that are deeply rooted in our institutions that of course result in that exclusion and advancement of specific people. And we've seen this in discriminatory laws, residential segregations, ethnic ghettos, poor health system, inferior education, unequal economic opportunities, and many more. But when it comes to racial discrimination, I really just wanted to touch on this, because this is a word that I see being confused with racism quite a bit. So racial discrimination can essentially happen to anyone. And that is discrimination based on someone's race. And that's usually an individual act. There's no system, and it can happen to anyone. So me as a brown woman could be racially discriminatory towards a white woman or Indigenous woman or anyone really. But racism, it's important to understand, is more persistent. It's not just an individual behavior or act, but it's a way of thinking that's institutionalized and inherited in our country. And so anyone in Canada can really experience racial discrimination, but only Black, Indigenous, and people of color can experience racism. So really important to understand the difference between racism and racial discrimination when talking about race in general. And I wanted to touch on privilege, because this is a word that we hear all the time in regards to various different conversations. And privilege is essentially an unearned advantage, something that you don't have control over, but you're essentially born with it. And it's usually not very visible to its holder. It's benefits, advantages by default. And because one kind of belongs to that privilege, they're considered, mainstream or normal and natural, because it's a dominant culture. And it's not just white privilege. It could be various different forms of privilege. For me personally, I would say my biggest privilege is that I'm able-bodied. And this is something that I think a lot of people don't even have to think about, right? Like we just go on with our day. I'm this and I'm that, and that's it. And I don't really consider how people who are not as abled as me experience their life. Or maybe if I'm working on a project or doing something, am I always, like I make websites for a living, so am I always thinking about, alt text on a website? Like how about people who are unable to see properly? So if they have a screen reader, are they able to see the alt text in that picture? Like there's so many different things that you need to consider when talking about ableism, but that's a really big privilege that I really like to bring up. And so the conversation, of course, comes with white privilege here, where we see that a lot in the media. We see a lot of folks talking about it, but I think a lot of the conversations that unfortunately surround around these words are negative, and also kind of like why are you making me feel guilty? Like, this is something I don't have control over. But privilege isn't about you feeling guilty for the way that you're born, but it's rather about you understanding that you have this benefit and what you can do about it. Like, how can you help others who don't have that benefit? So that's the important part about privilege. So those were just some quick terms that I wanted to throw again, because if we're going to talk about this, we got to understand. So, but why have these conversations about race and racism with kids? And I hear this quite a lot because we've done lots of presentations in various different schools for teachers, for businesses, for government, lots of different places. And for schools, continuously we hear, well, why do we need to talk about this? Like, we're just making it a bigger deal. It's like, why, you know? And just wanted to bring up 3 points. And the number one thing is that it's unavoidable, like it's a reality. Racism is a reality for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and it simply can't be ignored. We've ignored it for so long, and it's come to a point where you really can't, because these conversations are being had anyway. They're on the news, they're in our workplaces, they're in our schools, and they're being discussed widely, and they are not going anywhere. So we're at a point where we can't avoid these conversations. For Black, Indigenous, people of color, you definitely can't avoid it because you experience it, but even for white children, you can't avoid it. And if you don't have that conversation, you actually allow the dominant story or the conversation that's filling up to fill up children's brain, and that might not always be correct. It's also so important to expose children to normalized differences. So there's a huge lack of racial awareness and cultural understanding in North America in general. And we all, actually, all of us have to work hard to learn about other cultures and peoples, myself included. I know a lot about my culture, but do I know about, the hundreds of others? And in order to not be ignorant, we do have to expose ourselves and our children to these normalized differences, because we live in a multicultural society, and that's part of our duty living in this society. And kids pick up on what's going on, and they can hurt others with it. And we see this all the time in schools. We hear about it on the news all the time as well. And even, our organization gets a lot of different complaints from parents, for example, that we often forward depending to what school it is. But kids can, and they do pick up on harmful things, whether it's language, action, other things. And perhaps they pick it up from their households, their schools, their friends, society in general, and they might not even realize it. But if we don't talk to the kids about this topic, then they're going to pick it up from somewhere else. And again, that can be problematic because you're not sure what kind of information they're picking up. And how about the age limit? This is another question that we continuously get. What is the age limit? I'm not sure how to have this conversation. What about kids with different background? I'm not an expert. I don't know how to have this. Like, it makes me nervous. And studies show kids as young as 2 or 3 see racial differences. So, we all have biases that we develop in our infant years. This is something very natural that happens depending on our surroundings. So if we're continuously surrounded by people who look a certain way, eat a certain food, do certain things, then these are preferences and biases that we have over time. So when healthy questioning or curiosity comes up from children, that's actually completely normal. And if children come asking you these questions or are curious about something and perhaps even say problematic things or statements, it's important for teachers not to shy away from this conversation or say, we don't talk about that, because that's seen as sort of a punishment rather than having that conversation. And then they get more confused instead of trying to understand what's going on. And then we actually lead towards the problem, making it bigger instead of fixing it and trying to have that conversation. And it's important to note that these conversations can and will look different. So conversations and questions about race and racism will look different based on the kid's racial background because of their experiences. However, you as a teacher need to create that environment where these conversations can take place in a healthy and safe manner. This conversation should never, ever be about color blindness. I think this is the #1 complaints that we hear about all the time from parents, that our teachers, continuously their answer is that we don't see color, everybody is great, don't worry about a person's color. It doesn't matter. The solution is to be like, everyone's great and all's good. And I understand that that's an approach that they're thinking will help, but it's actually very problematic because what you're telling kids is that their experiences aren't real and to not see the person. And that might not automatically be the first thing that you think of, especially if you're not from the BIPOC community, but that's often what happens. And we see this as we grow up too. Like, how many times have I been in a workplace and we've done respectful workplace courses, and they've asked us about biases and racism and these types of conversations, and people have been like, I have no bias, I'm perfect, I have no problem, and I have nothing. And it's like and that's not necessarily true either. And if you say that you've always been like this, and then we know definitely that that's not true either. It's like, I don't see color. Like, that's not helping anything. And lastly, it's really actually all about being intentional. So your conversations that you have with the kids need to be very intentional. It's so important to expose children to normalize differences in our society. And this can actually take place in so many different ways. It could be a conversation, but it doesn't have to stop there. It could be class activities that you do, resources, toys if you're teaching younger kids, crayons, books that show differences of how different families do things, not just this person eats sushi sometimes and this person eats curry sometimes, but different activities that they do at home with their family that's related to their culture or perhaps a holiday. And kids need to talk and learn about race, and they need to embrace their own, and they need to accept others. This is actually something that can help our society quite a bit. So I really, really encourage teachers never to shy away from the conversation. And lastly, I just wanted to touch up on something that Courtney had also touched up on, but these conversations are hard, messy, and uncomfortable. I find, especially if you're not from the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community, you might feel that, perhaps there's a lack of understanding or experience. But the reality is that race relations is messy and also sometimes complicated because it does deal with people, and there isn't always a right answer, of course. But if it's important to understand that we all have strengths and weaknesses and privileges. And if we can showcase that we're not perfect, but we're trying our best to our kids and taking them part of that journey, and we're trying to improve and learn from each other, then I think that's most important. And I'm gonna pass it on to Courtney here.
Perfect, thank you. I have like two small little anecdotes I thought I'd share from my own experiences, just relating to what Iman was speaking about. And one of them is really just as a racialized person. So I'm half Black, half white. I've had some really funny experiences in my life that have really helped me shape these conversations as well too, especially when you're looking at kids and their degree of innocence. I personally avoided anything below high school as if with all energy when I became a teacher. But when I was doing my practicum, I entered into an elementary school, and one of my favorite experiences that I've ever had with regards to a memory, but also one of the most traumatizing things that's ever happened to me at the same time, was I'm like a hefty person, and this kid runs up to me and he's like, "Why are you so fat?" But here's the joke. This is why I'm telling this story, is because this kid did not mean it offensively, or to be honest, the kid didn't mean it with anything. He actually was just asking a very direct question using the language that he's familiar with. And there's like two ways that you can, of course, react to that. I chose the more teacherly approach, and I just straight up told him that I'm a really big fan of food. And he laughed and he's like, "Me too," and he walks away. The reason why I bring that up is because I personally, in my own life, had a very similar experience when I was a kid, and it was with my mom, right? Same direct question without any malicious intent, but I wasn't sure how to word it because I was young. And it was the time that I first realized that I was colored. I came home from school one day, I think I was in grade 3, and I remember just looking at my hand, and then looking at her, back to my hand, back to her. And I was like, huh, Why are you so white? And I remember she like got caught off guard and she didn't know what to do for a quick second, but I didn't mean anything by it. I was truly just looking at my skin and her skin. And that was the language that even in like grade 3, I already knew how to use. In grade 3, I knew how to say white. It was just that that was the first moment that I actually knew what that word meant. So she explained it to me. And she explained it to me amazingly because I didn't ask any questions after that. Frankly, it never really came up again until much later in life. She was clear and direct and she had very strong intention. These types of scenarios are really helpful for someone like myself, is that as a teacher going into high school, when I'm talking to students, it reminds me of all of the conversation that Iman just had with you, is that to understand the language, to speak with intentionality, and to not really shy away from it, because it's a reality that people know and it's a reality that people experience. So what we wanted to bring to the table is something very straightforward, and it is a series of scenarios that I've personally experienced. Rather than attempting to just choose random scenarios, I really wanted to share with you some examples from my own daily life as a teacher. So on one hand, I'm going to go kind of go left to right. So there are the nightmare scenarios that have to be done with such intention for them to be accurate. Otherwise, they risk a dangerous thing called tokenization. And that is something that we're all too familiar with in many places because it's habit, and it's an old habit, and that is multicultural fairs as a solution to racism. I've been in many schools throughout my life as a student, and I've been through many places where the immediate response to racial incidents is to have a cultural celebration, invite food and dances. However, a powerful conversation that I had a very long time ago really explained to me how these are really actually just enforcing people's, they run the danger of enforcing people's pre-existing stereotypes rather than allowing people to engage in a culture, engage in the other. So we should always be seeking to find ways to create engagement where it's no longer just putting another culture on display, but calling people in to experience something from that culture. So Indigenous elders, right? Strong BIPOC leaders coming in to have conversations about the challenges that they faced and their career paths as examples of success stories and normalization of the other rather than physically separating them through the form of a cultural dance. One of the more dangerous ones that I find as a coach, that I've run into often is racism in sports. You see, on one hand, people have spent a lot of time referring to racism in sports as just another form of bullying, and I strongly disagree because of the impact of it. While I acknowledge the traumatic nature of any incidents of bullying, absolutely any of them, the moment you bring a racialized experience in, we have to really now, we begin to engage in the long-standing effects of this dynamic, the power dynamic, the helplessness that's felt, and it's compounding. So sports are a dangerous example because I remember I've been in when I was a young coach, I was in a basketball game, and I was junior boys. I was a volunteer, and we're in the lineup, right? I'm at the end of the lineup. The team that we were playing, it was a relatively large, it was a predominantly white school, and throughout the lineup, I can see that the handshakes were getting very tense. What happened was is that the other team kept taking on. We had 3 black players, and every time they shook the hand of the black player, they pulled the hand. And as soon as they got close enough, they utilized racial slurs to bother him. Later, I find out that those same racial slurs were actually used during the game on the court. And then later, I find out even more is that fans of the other team were using them from the audience. And every time these people would run past, they'd whisper it just out of earshot so that many people couldn't hear it. And this kid had to keep playing. And he didn't say anything. He didn't say anything to me. He didn't say anything to his other teammates. He didn't say anything because he had to deal with it. Because it wasn't going to go away because there was still time on the clock. He had to focus, he had to battle through that to keep going. And where does that problem really fall? And the truth is, the problem falls on the people who said it. The problem falls on the people who stayed silent. And then the problem falls on those responsible for the players who didn't know how to handle it, myself included. As a young coach, I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know what venues to address my concerns. And then that naturally kind of segues into the third point here, is that ignoring racism concerns or complaints is actually a very common thing. Many people will play them off as best as possible as a misunderstanding, a poorly received joke, or it'll just really be just kind of ushered off into, like, we're really hoping people would just forget about them. And all it does is create a culture of people refusing to come forward and who don't feel supported. And that's one of the most dangerous things you can have when we don't feel safe, especially in a school system. And ignoring racism and ignoring the complaints is just a natural recipe to destroy a person's sense of safety. Just head to the next slide here. Other ones that I've come across that are slightly different is, of course, the use of, like, when as a Black person, the use of the N-word is way more common than people seem to understand. And that's a devastating fact, but it's the truth. The amount of times I've heard it, the amount of times I've been called down to the office as an anti-racism advocate to support the administration in teaching students the weight of that word, and the amount of times that, I'll tell you, one time I accidentally found someone's cell phone after hours in the fitness center at my school, and I was going to help find out who it was. So I turn on the screen, and their text messaging was open on the lock screen, and the words I saw were wild. Now, I don't jump to conclusions, but then I hear a knock on the door, and I go to the door quickly. I open the door, and there is, well, let's just say the words that were being used in the text message didn't match the physical person that was standing in front of me. And again, how often are we going to end up in these teaching positions where the weight is going to be on the person? Like, why should I, as a Black teacher, be the only one responding to these things? And the truth is, I'm not. It's just that I might be one of the few that are engaged and prepared to deal with the weight that comes with bullying and racialized bullying, because I've been a victim myself of racialized bullying. As a teacher, I actually have kind of a unique perspective, and that transitions to one of the more challenging texts that we often teach that I'm not even actually arguing with. This is just my own personal experience. To Kill a Mockingbird itself is something that you'll get a variety of people engaging with. You see, racism is a subject that's broached in so many classrooms, English, social studies, etc. It's a topic that is so socially relevant to almost every subject matter in the humanities, and even options, that you can't really avoid it. So certain texts that we'll study will engage with the language of a time past where this language was much more normalized. So because of that regularity of something like, say, for example, To Kill a Mockingbird, we run a risk. And it's a danger, it's a pretty terrible thing, but we run a risk of re-traumatizing the racialized students in the room, because without having, as educators, the proper preparation to deal with the emotion behind the word, with the preparation to understand how not to single out and create a culture of safety for racialized students in the room, to understand the full history behind the word, the history behind the language, the nuances that'll come with the subject matter, we really risk damaging our relationship with students in a way that's irreparable. It's very hard to come back from that, regardless of what your intention is. The third example is one that I'm becoming is very familiar, and it's when the racialized bullying turns into violence, right? And of course, the physical violence associated with racialized bullying, it carries a different element that traumatizes racialized students, traumatizes people in a way that emotional burden, especially with such a Eurocentric teaching staff in most schools without the ability to turn to someone who looks like them, who might have shared their experience in the teaching staff, then they have to carry that weight kind of alone sometimes when that violence becomes physical. Which is why it's so important for us to have these conversations, because it allows us to engage in a much more nuanced way. However, this, of course, is just a foundational conversation. It's going to begin that process, and it's a long one. So I'll show you 3 more scenarios as well. These scenarios, I decided to essentially remove the students a little bit, because as teachers and as educators and administrators, these are actually very common and very key. So the use of microaggressions, especially within the frame of fetishizing skin, hair, and body type, is all too common. And each of these, again, they destroy that feeling of safety and inclusivity that racialized students will feel. I've personally had to pull a teacher aside who was being excessively complimentary toward a Black student's braids in a way that was clearly making her uncomfortable because she felt like she was on display. Now, the interaction was not the greatest interaction, of course, because the person who was making those comments, they believed that they were simply just providing a compliment to the student. And I had to kind of circle around to remind the weight that comes from putting people of color, in this particular case was a Black student, putting Black students on display like that carries a lot of weight behind it because they don't feel normal, they feel othered. I've seen teacher to teacher prejudice and discrimination amongst peers. I have personally been on the wrong side of that. Like I've been at the receiving end of these things. And probably one of the hardest parts about that is that there are very few ways to deal with it that make people feel comfortable. Many teachers simply respond with ignorance, pretend they don't hear it. I think one of the most dangerous ones that I myself have been victim to in the past is that sometimes we play along. Because sometimes it's easier to play along than to fight. And sometimes it's easier to play along than to feign ignorance. And it creates a pretty dangerous cycle that I have personally engaged in, that I have to actively prevent myself from engaging in, because I've had to find the confidence to be able to call people out and then call them back in saying, you know, like that this is not okay, but it's not like, we can still be friends, just comments like this are not appropriate. Some teachers are afraid of reprisals or a lack of accountability, especially in the idea of disciplinary process. We don't know how it's going to turn out. So without a structured form of professional development to address these issues, there are a few things teachers know how to do in order to feel safe amongst peers. And that's my experience and the experience of many people that I've spoken with. And then the last thing that we really have to take care of to be mindful of is our power dynamics. We are in a very powerful, heavily accountable and responsible position. Principals, teachers, we should not be using this language, let alone should we ever be using this language directly to students. And if you've watched the news in the last year, you'll know that this is still an issue without even going into too much detail. We need to engage in the process of reconciliation in our schools. These situations, they're long, they're arduous, but that reconciliation process is not currently embedded in our system. And to be honest, prevention right now has to be a priority. We have to begin this process. And that's what we're doing here. So I'll pass it back to Iman, and she's going to provide some resources.
Thank you. Before I just get to the next slide, I just wanted to touch up on a lot of what Courtney said, and it's absolutely true. We did a study, I think it was 4 years ago, or maybe 5 now, I can't remember, where we interviewed 150 Albertan teachers, so really across Alberta, not just Calgary or Edmonton, lots of rural teachers as well. It was half and half. And we were talking about racism and multiculturalism in schools and how that's playing out. And about 50% at the time, teachers indicated that racism is a big concern in their classrooms. And a lot of the concerns that they brought up were that they don't have resources, so they don't have a proper system in their school, as well as resources on how to teach about racism, or even something like multiculturalism. They don't have the budget, they don't have support from their higher ups. The curriculum is not ideal for teaching this kind of stuff. It doesn't link to it. And their own personal identity. Most teachers are white, and especially the ones that we interviewed, many of them were white. I would say about 75% or even more were white. And they said again, like, I don't feel comfortable talking about this. We see this in our classrooms and I actually don't know what to do about it. And when parents come to me, I feel like my identity is getting in the way. I don't want to offend anyone. I don't want to hurt anyone. And I know, especially nowadays with technology progressing and people using it consistently and social media, people don't want to be called out. So they don't want to risk their career or jeopardize their personal identity. So how do we have these conversations? And it really goes back to, like, your intention and trying your best and making that clear and really thinking about things. So that education piece is definitely number one. Like, how do you become an anti-racist? We have lots of resources on our website, canadiancmf.com, but honestly, a simple Google search can do so much. There's so many books out there on how to be anti-racist. I think one book is actually called How to Be Anti-Racist or something like that. I can't remember, but that's an excellent example of how to start and where to start. And I'll just get into 3 simple resources here. And tolerance.org, I would say, is definitely one of the best ones. And perhaps you already use this in your classrooms, but I found that it has so much, particularly relating to race and racism. Lots of great resources and resources for all needs. So not only for able-bodied kids. Facinghistory.org is also great, and same with sparktools.org/raceworks. These are just 3 major ones that I know that a lot of teachers in our group use. But the last resource that I actually wanted to point out is actually our resource hub, which is launching in the summer of 2021, so this summer, and this is the Alberta K-12 Multicultural and Anti-Racism Resource Hub. So this is a very unique project. A project like this does not exist anywhere. And Alberta is actually the pilot for this because our organization is located in Alberta. Most of our members are from Alberta, and we have about 30-ish teachers on our team right now that are working on this project, and lots of other volunteers as well. So essentially it's a website hub with hundreds, or not hundreds, thousands of resources that relate to either multiculturalism or anti-racism from K to 12 in all subjects. So not just social studies, although social studies is the main one in each category for obvious reasons, but even science, math, music, English, art, other subjects as well. And the resources, they can be videos, presentations, class activities, assignments, teacher resources. So like not just for kids, but even for teachers to use. So the resources look like there's a vast amount of them, and they actually link to the Alberta curriculum. So I would say that's probably been like the hardest part, linking to the Alberta curriculum, because there's not always a direct link, but we've been doing our best to link them. So we have outcomes. So if you go to, kindergarten, social studies, unit 1, can't remember what it's called, but I think it's like My Identity or something like that. So it would go to unit 1, and then you would see all the different resources underneath it. And how you can utilize them in your class. So it links you to the resource. So these resources are already ones that exist out there. So we link you to the resource. We have like a description about what it is. We have like how to use it, so suggested uses that we have. Of course, you can use it in your own way as well. We also have an accessibility section. So how accessible is it to differing needs? And yeah, the list is huge. The list is awesome. It's launching in the summer of 2021. Again, it's starting out with Alberta. Our hope is that it can go across provinces and territories. But I also wanted to let folks know that we still need help with this. We're not launching it until the summer of 2021 because we still have a few more resources in some subjects and grades that need to be linked to the curriculum, and we're having a hard time finding more volunteers. So our organization, Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation, is completely volunteer run. So all the teachers who are working this, all the volunteers who've been working on this project for 4+ years are doing this out of their own time. Like they either have school that they go to or work or kids or various other commitments, but they've been very, very committed to this project for many years now. And we're just so excited to be launching it this summer, ready for fall time for teachers to use. So if you are interested, please connect with us. It will be available in the summer. To find out more information, it's CanadianCMF.com. It's right here on the screen, CanadianCMF.com. We would absolutely love for you to join. We would love for you to use it. We're also going to be having users testing it out before it's launched. Oh, and one last thing, all the resources are actually vetted. So they're actually validated to some extent. So what we're doing is that we're connecting with different cultural organizations and religious organizations, particularly for resources that relate to specific cultures or religions. So the major a community resource that we have here, either in Calgary, Edmonton, or other places in Alberta, we're connecting with them and letting them know, here are a few resources that we're putting on our website that relate and talk about you. Can you please confirm that you are okay with this information being out there? Because that's also a concern that we consistently heard from working with a lot of ethnic and religious associations, where they said a lot of the times textbooks have false information, or teachers give false information, or students are spreading false information about our culture, our identity, our religion, and it's causing problems and it's leading to more racism or religious discrimination. So we're definitely trying to provide solutions for that as well. But that's it for our presentation. Thank you for joining today's class. We hope we gave you an understanding of what race and racism terms are, as well as why it's important to have this conversation. What age groups, how do you have these conversations, some scenarios with some solutions and tips, as well as some resources, as well as our resource that's coming up. But now we're open for questions and comments, and I'm just going to stop sharing my screen here. So I'm not sure if we should just read if there are any comments here, or if Caitlin, if
it's up to you, Iman. I can read them for you if you'd like.
Sure, that might be easier.
Sure. Thank you so much. I am student services at a middle school, and doing my best to support a student who shared that she doesn't feel like she belongs here because there aren't any students, quote unquote, like her. Any feedback you can offer?
So I'd love to jump in. The big question that I always have for any student who feel isolated is what is the kind of the sense of community that they're looking for? It's not so much as to really call her out and to say, like that there's nothing here for you. It's to help identify. So one of the aspects that is really powerful, and this is like a good answer and a bad answer. And what I mean by that is there is an answer and it takes a while. The school communities that we engage in, we have so historically, or at least I should say my experience at schools, we've so historically been engaged in the process of building a school community around the name. So for example, if your school is, Pearson, then it's the Pearson community. One really powerful tool to start building these concepts is to engage in the different communities that exist within that community. So while this one individual student might not see others that look like her or feel like her, by having some form of recognition of the fact that there is a vast amount of diversity, even within people that might not physically look like her, whether that be religion, whether that be culture, whether that be ethnicity, then what that does for most students, myself included, is it makes me realize that there are many people that deserve to be celebrated, and that I am also one of those people that deserve to be celebrated. So the short-term answer is, of course, really engage with that. Like I would, if I was that student, I would just want to be engaged in about what my culture is, what I feel would make me feel like home. And the long-term answer is to start developing that sense of community where we're celebrating differences outside of just skin color, so that we can really start to help people recognize the amount of unique people in our school communities.
I just wanted to quickly add on to that. And it's, for me, I think that's a little bit about what's othering her. There might be very obvious reasons here. I don't know the scenario, but what is it that's othering her? Because I can think of examples where I've felt that way. Not particularly in schools, because I was very lucky to grow up in the Northeast, where quite a few people looked like me, or at least my neighbors did, if not in school. But I can think of lots of examples in the workplace where I felt othered. For example, for religious beliefs. So I'm Muslim, so I do fast, and during Ramadan, many times I've heard those inappropriate comments about you don't need to diet, you don't, like, why are you even doing this? This is so stupid. And like lots of other comments that are unnecessary and really just shows that this person doesn't understand. And also people thinking that I'm offended by them eating, which I'm not, I never will be, and no one should be. So these types of scenarios, like, why did I feel othered? Is there anybody Muslim in my workplace? No. Is there anybody racialized in my workplace? They just hired someone who's Chinese, so that's great. There's one more person now, and I work in a company with hundreds of people. But anyways, it wasn't really for me that somebody had to look like me or believe in what I believe in for me to not feel othered. It's rather the comments and the atmosphere and continuously making me feel like the other. And the Ramadan example is just one example, but there's hundreds of examples that I can give that happen every day at work that makes me feel others, that doesn't make me feel like I belong in that community. So it really comes back to that education piece where what Courtney's talking about, where we need people to understand the differences. And this is why anti-racism and multicultural education is so important, because once we understand the differences with people, we don't try to other them. We understand that, hey, they are different than us, and that's actually okay, and we can be friends. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah. One last thing too, one really powerful tool that has made me feel very comfortable is normalized representation in the resources that we utilize every day. So what I mean by that is, it's not trying to avoid, and this will take some active decision making as well too as educators, trying to avoid the utilization of certain resources and texts purely on the fact of its diversity, and instead doing your best to engage with certain texts because of the value that they bring to the audience, so that they can feel like kind of represented in the texts that they're being studied. And I'll give you like a prime example. There's some pretty great films that are out that are made by, like, say, Black filmmakers, that in no way do you actually have to discuss Blackness, but the effect of seeing yourself reflected on the screen is enough to kind of call students in. And if it's treated in such a normal way, without the necessity of saying like, this is it's Black History Month, this is what we're watching. It's just like, no, this is just valuable. Those are great opportunities. And that is one of the downsides of any, like, for what we mentioned as cultural festivals, is because they do isolate and other, whereas representation in the normal capacity of our educational facilities is a great way of just making people feel welcomed and normal.
Yes, and it doesn't mean that you can't have cultural festivals. I think you need to go beyond that too, is what it means, and maybe even discussing it with the kids. And really just want to touch again on what Courtney said about that representation piece. So that resource, for example, when I say that we have math and science in it, clearly we're not going to be talking about racism in math and science. We're showing that representation. We have TEDx talks and other resources from great leaders and successful people from the BIPOC community. That's how we're doing it. We're linking it to the curriculum because it's about that topic that you discuss in that class and grade, but it's actually being taught, or some sort of representation piece in there by a person of color, which is something actually quite rare.
Thank you so much, Courtney and Iman. Looks like the chat is mostly saying thank you so much, and teachers are excited to start using what they've learned today. Iman, could you again highlight where teachers can go to say if they are interested in helping you to finish creating the hub for summer 2021?
Yes, please
well,
go. Oh, sorry.
No, sorry, I just wanted to try and jump in. Jackie Connolly, I think she had a question as well too.
It's okay if I just ask my question like this. So I teach grade 12 English, and thank you for all the information, totally echoing everything in the chat about how informative and awesome this has been. And we've been, as a department, working really hard all semester on being intentional in our resources. We had some really powerful Indigenous poets speak to our kids, and because the COVID's actually helping us because we can webcast everything to everybody. So that's really awesome. My question is, I taught Slumdog Millionaire this year because it's a story centered around non-white peoples, and I was excited about that. And then after I did it, I was like, should I have spoken to or asked a person from that culture, that community, because it kind of like reinforces like ideas of like poverty and third worldness. And we had good conversations around it, and I think it did turn out valuable. But ultimately I'm like, if I'm picking a text not from a culture I'm familiar with, how would you suggest I go about doing that so that I don't reinforce damaging or unhelpful ideas? Does that make sense, that question? Yeah.
No, definitely. The simple answer is actually become familiar with it. And I know that sounds kind of like a cop-out a little bit, but it's truly, there are two questions that I ask people whenever it comes to really dealing with anything with diverse texts, and it's, do you know the culture enough to actually engage in it, or are you for being kind of like a gatekeeper of information?
Right.
As in, here's what I've learned and I'm transferring it to you. And so whereas when you start to become more engaged in it, or if you start to use the voices of other people that you can amplify, who can speak to the subject matter, you end up like really, it's a really awesome learning process when you start to figure out everything. And the second thing that I always ask people is actually why they chose it. So I'm an English teacher as well too myself. And when I choose a text, I have to choose a text that speaks to me. There's just, that's the nuts and bolts of it, right? Is I'm like, it has to be a text that speaks to me. When we are dealing with texts that are, you don't want to just choose a text to force representation in your class.
Right.
And I'm not saying that you're doing that either, right? It's just that really you should be able, when I talk about that normalization, you should be able to like love that film. And if you love that film, your respect of it will come through. And that's that intention, right, that we always talk about. It truly, like, if you can, when you crush the intention, like, I love this film, it happens to be diverse, you've done the work to learn the culture, which only likely enhanced your understanding of it. And then to always kind of consistently remind students of your limitations as an outsider. And it's something that I have to be very mindful of myself. Because what I don't know, I really have to acknowledge. And that gives me some very safe space to make a lot of mistakes, right? Because when I say that, when I open up with that kind of humility of not knowing, and here's what I do know and here's what I don't know. I've never, because a lot of people are always concerned about offense, like offending students. I've never actually offended a single student because I began that with like, I love this film because it's a film. I loved it so much. I went and learned a bunch about everything so that I can understand every nuance in it. And I know that I have a lot more to learn. And I'm going to make mistakes, but that's okay because I'm here because I appreciate this, if that makes sense. Long answer, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think one thing I think I did well in navigating it is I gave the lead to students in my class who spoke Hindi and have very strong connections to that culture. And so there was like, they were like, that subtitle is wrong. And like, that's not actually what they're saying. Or they're like, they're saying this word and this word is like really like important in Hindi and like the reason they're saying this. And so I think I was proud of how that went, but I think there was many times when I didn't do as good of a job as I could have. But thank you for answering my question. I will hop off video here.
And what you just said about amplifying the voices in the room is so important. If a student wants to correct you culturally, I'm like diving into those moments too, right? Like I'm engaging in them 100%, and I'm like, please do, because that means that we're learning together. So that's awesome. I love that you did that.
You might get an email from me, Courtney, because I teach in the CBE too. So
okay. No worries.
I just wanted to add to that. I totally agree. I think that's a great example. When I was in high school, we actually did watch that movie, and it was a great discussion. And I'm brown, so it's something that really touched me culturally as well. And I can tell you, I really appreciated that we were able to watch something like that. And for me personally, it wasn't like, obviously there's a lot of sad and negative moments in the film, but that are equally important. It makes for great conversation, and that's important for kids to have, regardless of whatever it may be, and to see reality that other people have. So awesome work.
Awesome. We had another question from a teacher saying that the teacher is mostly white and the students in the class are mostly white. How do you go about introducing this topic?
I'll take a shot at it as well. I think the best way to approach it is through the conversation of privilege as the foundation. And not really even specific to racial privilege either, but privilege and helping people understand privilege is an amazing way to engage in accountability. A lot of people get caught between two words, responsibility and accountability. And in many times when you're talking about anti-racism work, people are talking about accountability, but people are reflecting on responsibility. Like, is it my responsibility to fix racism? Is it my responsibility to solve the historical transgressions of the world? And the answer is no. No one can determine what your responsibility is. That's something that maybe your educators, your system, the society can determine, but I can't determine that for you. But accountability is a little bit of a different conversation, because accountability is something that everybody can really come to terms with and understand. And this idea that if we really are the community that we claim, if we are the mosaic society that we love to boast on the international scale in Canada, then that means that we are accountable to each other. So when you begin these conversations with privilege, it allows you this beautiful entryway into all the different ways we are accountable and in many ways like profit off of systems of discrimination that are historical. And if you recognize that if you profit off of something, then you are also accountable in its continued existence. So that conversation on privilege is like really key, because as you start to gain that more power, then you recognize that you're the ones who are allowing a system of unfairness and inequity to continue. Now, I haven't even mentioned like race in that conversation, and that's actually part of the idea, is because then, like Iman mentioned, when you acknowledge that you have privileges as well too. Like, I know that I am a light skin, like Black male, which means that I have, like, when it comes down to colorism, I have a benefit there. When it comes to the fact that I'm a man, I have a huge benefit in the patriarchal society. I come from I have an education, right? So I'm credentialed, which is another privilege, right? Education, as everyone who says, high school education and basic education is a right, but secondary education is a privilege. And so by having these conversations, then it's always been a great entryway for me to then discuss accountability and be like, okay, well, now that I've taken advantage of systems that have disadvantaged others, so now in what ways am I holding myself accountable to making sure that I'm bringing other people up? And that's always been a great entryway to that conversation, because then you can segue to all the different types of privileges and discuss all the different ways people can be accountable to changing those systems, if that makes sense. Sometimes I ramble. Iman knows this.
Yeah, and I just wanted to totally agree with Courtney. The only thing I wanted to add on to that, I think it may help to just set the tone for the conversation right away. Like, why are we having this conversation and what is the goal? The goal, I mean, it depends on your goal, but I'm guessing it's because you want to have these conversations and have teachers understand and make sure that their classrooms are inclusive and begin an anti-racist journey. Again, I don't know what your goal is, but I think having that intent set from the beginning, like this is our goal and this is what we're here to do, will really help, instead of just being like, so it's on the news and we have these issues. Like, that's like being vague about it isn't going to help, and it's actually going to complicate things.
Awesome. Thank you. Another question from Chris. Thank you for all your work. I have a question about creating a thoughtful learning community. In general, I feel my goal as a teacher is to help students ask questions, find information, and generate informed ideas and opinions. When it comes to race and racism, I feel like there is a clear right and wrong way to think and feel. Any suggestions for allowing students space to share and be honest without allowing students to hurt or burden their BIPOC classmates?
Iman, if I've been going first, if you have ideas, feel free to jump in. I don't want to railroad you.
You're just better at talking than I am, so I'm like, I'll just let him go first, and I'll be like, I agree with him. But again, like, I'm not a teacher, but I continuously keep thinking about these scenarios and how they relate to like workplace environments that I have had. So I can, like, going back to like respectful workplace or multicultural courses type of thing that I've seen in workplaces, like the goal of that has been like, we want staff to learn about the diversity of like racial diversity or ethnic diversity that exists in our, in our society. But there have been, like, when it actually comes down to asking questions, most people have been shy, like not wanting to talk. So clearly there's something that they want to talk about, but they don't feel comfortable. And then the other conversations have been very racist and like sometimes extremely racist. And it has been a bit traumatizing. And at one point in time, I was actually the facilitator of that conversation with 200 staff, and most of them were actually supervisors and higher ups, and saying very problematic things about certain cultures, particularly even some that I belong to, was quite like, putting me on the spot. But to be honest, I appreciated just being able to answer straight away and being like, hey, so that's a perfect example of racism. Like maybe that's like too extreme, but that's how I phrased it as a facilitator. So I wanted to just say the facilitating, I think, is key here, because it's that person that's creating that safe environment, right? So you need to be ready, and I talked about that book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, by Ibram X. Kendi. It's an excellent book. It gives lots of examples and ways on how to do this. And tolerance.org also has lots of examples as well, where I think it really, like, you can have these conversations. Yes, there are some very clear right and wrongs, but there's also, again, that curiosity, that confusion, that misunderstanding. So how do we have those conversations? And it really comes honestly down to like that space. Like, how do you create that safe space? And just like how we started this presentation, we laid out, here are the rules. We want to have this conversation. We want you to feel comfortable, and understanding that it may be an uncomfortable conversation, but respect is most important. So laying down rules is really important as well. But again, if you shy away from that conversation, I think that could actually be worse. depending on the situation, obviously, if they're not like swearing and saying incredibly rude things.
Yeah, I just adding on to it because it was pretty solid. The two things that I would suggest are two thinking structures that I use as a teacher, and they can be honestly used at any level. Like they're not special to like high school or anything, but they're fundamental to my teaching practice. And it is, I spend, like, whenever I have tough conversations around oppression and intersectionality of like discrimination and all these things, I always bring up lots of the simple bases of logical fallacies. As a teacher, you have to do more work than they do. There's no way around it. As an educator of any kind, there's no way around it. You have to do a lot of work. You gotta kind of hold yourself accountable, and you gotta dismantle your own kind of logical fallacies, because most discrimination is based off of logical thought. And that's a dangerous thing in having conversations. If the students aren't prepared to call out logical thoughts that actually are fallacies. And I'll give you a million, like I can give you examples. One of the more common ones, I got into an argument with an Ambrose University professor while I was doing some work trying to get an anti-racism task force built. And the argument essentially swayed off into, what if Black people are more inclined to criminality? There's a university professor here. And I said, well, what do you mean? And they're like, well, what are the chances that there are more people in jail who are Black, that speaks to the fact that Black culture is actually one that is more criminal? To him, that is actually a logical conclusion. He looked at the data and he made a logical conclusion from it. So you really have to isolate the logical fallacies in a lot of these arguments to be able to decipher them. So when people make them, a lot of people make logical arguments that end up being hyper discriminatory and dangerous with a lack of understanding. They just don't know that they're missing something here. So you have to be prepared to point out what's missing. The second tool that I use often outside of logical fallacies, side note, I have like a PDF and a great chart that I share with my students every year, and I go through all the different logical fallacies. And then it's a really fun, like, kind of thought exercise to when applying it to real life scenarios. And a lot of these real life scenarios are race. The second thought process that I tend to go over with I refer to it as the scales of justice, just because I love the analogy and the visual. But I always take two ideas and I put them against each other. And I let the kids' morals, their moral stability, weigh them out. And they almost always have a side. And there's no such thing as 50-50. I always say it's 51-49. There's always one side that's better than the other. So in these thought experiments and these informed class discussions, if someone wants to make an opinion on something, I say, okay, put them on the scale. Which one causes more hurt? Which one causes more benefit? And that will always lead you to the moral answer. And it's a great thing because students will go through these engagements and they'll recognize flaws in their own thinking, or they'll sometimes back away from problematic ideas and concepts because, hey, we just did the little test, put it on the scale. Who does it hurt? Does it hurt more people than it benefits? Immediately, you have a moral answer to it, which is why I think it's very funny when you say, I feel like there's a clear right and wrong way to think and feel, is because whenever you like put anything in the moral scales, I agree. There almost always is a right and a wrong. There always is a good and a bad way. And it's usually pretty clear for most students. And the younger you get, I find the more clear it is. Like when you get like elementary school, I love those kids. I don't want to teach them. I love them because they have a better sense of morality than most adults do. We tend to rationalize everything, but put it on the scale and they'll be able to make a right decision. So those two thinking processes are really key for me when I'm having discussions.
As a grade 5 teacher, Courtney, I can tell you that scale will just topple every time. They'll know instantly which side is going to bump up or which side's going to come right down. Yeah. And hats off to you, because I can only handle the younger ones. That's so wonderful. So I just
It's good.
wanted to let everybody know again that this recording will be on the Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation. Hopefully we're going to get that up in the next few days here. And you can also get in touch with Local 38, ATA Local 38. I didn't see any other questions in there. Would either of you like to say anything as a final parting goodbye?
Honestly, I just want to say thank you everybody for being here. And if you have any questions and you're within the CBE, I'm like searchable. Courtney Walcott, you can find me in the directory.
I also wanted to say thank you so much and all to everyone for attending, for the ATA, for allowing us to have this conversation. It's incredibly important. And also for Courtney for co-hosting and doing an amazing job. Again, our website is CanadianCMF.com. We would love for you to join us and volunteer with us. Any questions that you have beyond this as well, feel free to send our way. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Iman. Thank you so much, Courtney. Thank you so much to everyone who participated. I hope we're all walking away from this feeling like we can do something a little bit more than we did yesterday, if not a lot more than we did yesterday. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.